Catherine of Aragon. December 16, 1485 to January 7, 1536. Aged 50, Catherine was Queen of England as the first wife of King Henry VIII from their marriage on June 11, 1509 until its annulment on May 23, 1533. Born in Spain, she was Princess of Wales while married to Henry's elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, for a short period before his death. The daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, Catherine was 3 years old when she was betrothed to Arthur, heir apparent to the English throne. They married in 1501, but Arthur died 5 months later. Catherine spent years in limbo, and during this time, she held the position of ambassador of the Aragonese crown to England in 1507, the first known female ambassador in European history. She married Henry shortly after his accession in 1509. For 6 months in 1513, she served as regent of England while Henry was in France. During that time, the English defeated a Scottish invasion at the Battle of Flodden, an event in which Catherine played an important part with an emotional speech about courage and patriotism. By 1526, Henry was infatuated with Anne Boleyn and dissatisfied that his marriage to Catherine had produced no surviving sons, leaving their daughter Mary as heir presumptive at a time when there was no established precedent for a woman on the throne. He sought to have their marriage annulled, setting in motion a chain of events that led to England's schism with the Catholic Church. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry defied him by assuming supremacy over religious matters in England. In 1533, their marriage was consequently declared invalid and Henry married Anne on the judgment of clergy in England, without reference to the Pope. Catherine refused to accept Henry as supreme head of the Church in England and considered herself the king's rightful wife and queen, attracting much popular sympathy. Despite this, Henry acknowledged her only as Dowager Princess of Wales. After being banished from court by Henry, Catherine lived out the remainder of her life at Kimbolton Castle, dying there in January 1536 of cancer. The English people held Catherine in high esteem, and her death set off tremendous mourning. Her daughter Mary would become the first undisputed English queen regnant in 1553. Burial. January 29, 1536. Peterborough Cathedral, England. Anne Boleyn. March 21, 1501 to May 19, 1536. Aged 35. Anne Boleyn 1501 or 1507 to 19 May 1536, was Queen of England from 1533 to 1536, as the second wife of King Henry VIII. The circumstances of her marriage and execution by beheading for treason made her a key figure in the political and religious upheaval that marked the start of the English Reformation, and was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, later Earl of Wiltshire, and his wife, Elizabeth Howard, and was educated in the Netherlands and France. And returned to England in early 1522, to marry her cousin James Butler, 9th Earl of Ormond. The marriage plans were broken off, and instead, she secured a post at court as maid of honor to Henry VIII's wife, Catherine of Aragon. Early in 1523, and was secretly betrothed to Henry Percy, son of Henry Percy, 5th Earl of Northumberland, but the betrothal was broken off when the Earl refused to support it. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey refused the match in January 1524. In February or March 1526, Henry VIII began his pursuit of Anne. She resisted his attempts to seduce her, refusing to become his mistress, as her sister Mary had previously been. Henry focused on annulling his marriage to Catherine, so he would be free to marry Anne. After Wolsey failed to obtain an annulment from Pope Clement VII, it became clear the marriage would not be annulled by the Catholic Church. As a result, Henry and his advisors, such as Thomas Cromwell, began breaking the Church's power in England and closing the monasteries. Henry and Anne formally married on January 25, 1533, after a secret wedding on November 14, 1532. On May 23, 1533, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer declared Henry and Catherine's marriage null and void. 5 days later, he declared Henry and Anne's marriage valid. Clement excommunicated Henry and Cranmer. As a result of the marriage and excommunications, the first break between the Church of England and Catholic Church took place, and the king took control of the Church of England and was crowned queen on June 1, 1533. On September 7, she gave birth to the future Queen Elizabeth I. Henry was disappointed to have a daughter, but hoped a son would follow and professed to love Elizabeth. And subsequently had 3 miscarriages, and by March 1536, Henry was courting Jane Seymour. Death and burial. Thomas Cranmer, who was the sole supporter of and in the council. The ermine mantle was removed and lifted off her headdress, tucking her hair under a coif. After a brief farewell to her weeping ladies and a request for prayers, she knelt down and one of her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. She knelt upright, in the French style of beheadings. Her final prayer consisted of her repeating, continually, "Jesu receive my soul, O Lord God have pity on my soul." The execution consisted of a single stroke. It was witnessed by Thomas Cromwell, Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk, the King's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, the Lord Mayor of London, as well as aldermen, sheriffs and representatives of the various craft guilds. Most of the King's council were also present. Cranmer, who was at Lambeth Palace, was reported to have broken down in tears after telling Alexander Alash, "She who has been the Queen of England on earth will today become a queen in heaven." When the charges were first brought against Anne, Cranmer had expressed his astonishment to Henry and his belief that she should not be culpable. Cranmer felt vulnerable because of his closeness to the Queen on the night before the execution. He declared Henry's marriage to Anne to have been void, like Catherine's before her. He made no serious attempt to save Anne's life, although some sources record that he had prepared her for death by hearing her last private confession of sins, in which she had stated her innocence before God. On the day of her death, a Scottish friend found Cranmer weeping uncontrollably in his London gardens, saying that he was sure that Anne had now gone to heaven. She was then buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her skeleton was identified during renovations of the chapel in 1876, in the reign of Queen Victoria, and Anne's grave is now identified on the marble floor. Jane Seymour. December 13, 1507 to October 24, 1537. Age 29. Jane Seymour, December 13, 1507 to October 24, 1537. Was Queen of England as the third wife of King Henry VIII from their marriage on May 30, 1536 until her death the next year. Death and funeral. Portrait of Jane believed to have been painted during her short queenship and attributed to the cast shadow workshop. Jane's labor had been difficult, lasting 2 days and 3 nights, probably because the baby was not well positioned. After the christening, it became clear that she was seriously ill. She died on October 24, 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. Within a few weeks, there were conflicting accounts of the cause of her death. According to King Edward's biographer Jennifer Loach, her death may have been due to an infection from a retained placenta. According to Alison Weir, she may have succumbed to puerperal fever following a bacterial infection contracted during the birth. Weir has also speculated, after medical consultation, that the cause of her death was a pulmonary embolism. Jane was buried on November 12, 1537 in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle after the funeral, in which her stepdaughter Mary acted as chief mourner. A procession of 29 mourners followed Mary, one for every year of Jane's life. She was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral. And of Cleves. September 22, 1515 to July 16, 1557. Age 41 years. Death. When Anne's health began to fail, Mary allowed her to live at Chelsea Old Manor, where Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, had lived after her remarriage. Here, in the middle of July 1557, Anne dictated her last will, and died at Chelsea Old Manor on July 16, 1557. The most likely cause of her death was cancer. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, on 3 August, in what has been described as a somewhat hard-to-find tomb. On the opposite side of Edward the Confessor's shrine and slightly above eye level. For a person of average height. Here, in the middle of July 1557, and dictated her last will. Anne's epitaph in Westminster Abbey, which is in English, reads simply. And of Cleves, Queen of England. Born 1515, died 1557. Catherine Howard, Queen of England. 1524–13, February 1542. Age 18 years. Catherine Howard, also spelled Catherine Howard, was Queen of England from 1540 until 1541 as the fifth wife of King Henry VIII. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper, a cousin to Anne Boleyn, and the niece of Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen on November 23, 1541 and imprisoned in the New Sion Abbey, Middlesex, formerly a convent, where she remained throughout the winter of 1541. She was obliged by a privy councillor to return the ring previously owned by and of Cleves, which the king had given her. It was a symbol of removal of her regal and lawful rights. The king would be at Hampton Court, but she would not see him again. Despite these actions, her marriage to Henry was never formally annulled. Culpeper and Derham were arraigned at Guildhall on December 1, 1541, for high treason. They were executed at Tyburn on December 10, 1541, Culpeper being beheaded and Derham being hanged, drawn and quartered. According to custom, their heads were placed on spikes on London Bridge. Many of Catherine's relatives were also detained in the Tower, tried, found guilty of concealing treason and sentenced to life imprisonment and forfeiture of goods. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, distanced himself from the scandal by retreating to Kenninghall to write a letter of apology, laying all the blame on his niece and stepmother. His son Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a poet, remained a favourite of the king. Meanwhile, the king sank further into morbidity and indulged his appetite for food and women. Catherine remained in limbo until Parliament introduced on January 29, 1542 a Bill of Attainder, which was passed on February 7, 1542. The Royal Assent by Commission Act 1541 made it treason, and punishable by death, for a queen consort to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to commit adultery with her. This measure retroactively solved the matter of Catherine's supposed pre-contract and made her unequivocally guilty. No formal trial was held. When the Lords of the Council came for her, she allegedly panicked and screamed as they manhandled her into the barge that would escort her to the Tower on Friday, February 10, 1542. Her flotilla passing under London Bridge, where the heads of Culpeper and Derham were impaled, and where they remained until 1546. Entering through the Traitor's Gate, she was led to her prison cell. The next day, the Bill of Attainder received royal assent and her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday, February 13, 1542. Arrangements for the execution were supervised by Sir John Gage in his role as Constable of the Tower. When the Lords of the Council came for her, she allegedly panicked and screamed as they manhandled her into the barge that would escort her to the Tower on Friday, February 10, 1542. Her flotilla passing under London Bridge, where the heads of Culpeper and Derham were impaled, and where they remained until 1546. Entering through the Traitor's Gate, she was led to her prison cell. The next day, the Bill of Attainder received royal assent and her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday, February 13, 1542. Arrangements for the execution were supervised by Sir John Gage in his role as Constable of the Tower. Francis I, when told by Sir William Paget how the Queen had wonderfully abused the King, laid his hand on his heart and announced by his faith as a gentleman that she hath done wondrous naughtly. Upon hearing news of Catherine's execution, King Francis wrote a letter to Henry regretting the lewd and naughty, evil, behavior of the Queen and advising him that the lightness of women cannot bend the honor of men. Lady Rochford was executed immediately thereafter on Tower Green. Both bodies were buried in an unmarked grave in the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where the bodies of Catherine's cousins, and George Bullen, also lay. Other cousins were also in the crowd, including the Earl of Surrey. King Henry did not attend. Catherine's body was not one of those identified during restorations of the chapel during Queen Victoria's reign. She is commemorated on a plaque on the west wall, dedicated to all those who died in the Tower. Catherine Parr. 1512, September 5, 1548. Age 36 years. Catherine Parr was the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr, Lord of the Manor of Kendal in Westmoreland, now in Cumbria, and Maud Green, daughter and co-heiress of Sir Thomas Green, Lord of Greens Norton, Northamptonshire, and Joan Fogg. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine had been raised as a Catholic but at some point turned to Protestantism. Sir Thomas Parr was a descendant of King Edward III, and the Parrs were a substantial northern family, which included many knights. Final marriage and death. Shortly before Henry died, Henry made provision for an allowance of £7,000 per year for Catherine to support herself. He further ordered that, after his death, Catherine, though a Queen Dowager, should be given the respect of a Queen of England, as if he were still alive. After the coronation of her stepson, Edward VI, on January 31, 1547, Catherine retired from court to her home at Old Manor in Chelsea. Following Henry's death, Catherine's old love and the new king's uncle, Thomas Seymour, who was soon created first Baron Seymour of Sudeley, returned to court. Catherine was quick to accept when Seymour renewed his suit of marriage. Since only 4 months had passed since the death of King Henry, Seymour knew that the Regency Council would not agree to a petition for the Queen Dowager to marry so soon. Sometime near the end of May, Catherine and Seymour married in secret. King Edward VI and the council were not informed of the union for several months. When their union became public knowledge, it caused a small scandal. The King and Lady Mary were very much displeased by the union. After being censured and reprimanded by the council, Seymour wrote to the Lady Mary asking her to intervene on his behalf. Mary became furious at his forwardness and tasteless actions and refused to help. Mary even went as far as asking her half-sister, Lady Elizabeth, not to interact with Queen Catherine any further. During this time, Catherine began having altercations with her brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset. Like Thomas, Edward was the king's uncle, and also was the Lord Protector. A rivalry developed between Catherine and his wife, her own former lady-in-waiting, and Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, which became particularly acute over the matter of Catherine's jewels. The Duchess argued that Catherine, as Queen Dowager, was no longer entitled to wear the jewels belonging to the wife of the king. Instead she, as the wife of the Protector, should be the one to wear them. The whole ordeal left her relationship with Catherine permanently damaged. The relationship between the two Seymour brothers also worsened as a result, since Thomas saw the whole dispute as a personal attack by his brother on his social standing. In November 1547, Catherine published her third book, The Lamentation of a Sinner. The book promoted the Protestant concept of justification by faith alone, which the Catholic Church deemed to be heresy. It was sponsored by Catherine Brandon, the Duchess of Suffolk, and by William Parr, Catherine's brother, and William Cecil, Elizabeth I's future chief minister, wrote the preface. In 1544 or 1545, Parr had started to organize an English translation of Erasmus's paraphrases upon the New Testament, and the massive volume was finally printed in January 1548. Parr had enlisted Nicholas Udall, Thomas Keyes, and Mary Tudor to translate different sections, and she may have produced the paraphrase of Matthew. In July 1547, the Edwardian state ordered every parish to obtain a copy, and many generations of literate parishioners would have encountered lengthy dedications praising Parr's learning, her commitment to the vernacular Bible, and her role in the English Reformation. Parr owned many books, and she participated in the cultural practice of writing in her books and signing books that belonged to others. At the age of 35, Catherine became pregnant. This pregnancy was a surprise, as Catherine had not conceived during her first 3 marriages. During this time, Seymour began to take an interest in Lady Elizabeth. Seymour had reputedly plotted to marry her before marrying Catherine, and it was reported later that Catherine discovered the two in an embrace. On a few occasions before the situation risked getting completely out of hand, according to the deposition of Cat Ashley, Catherine appears not only to have acquiesced in episodes of horseplay, but actually to have assisted her husband. Whatever actually happened, Elizabeth was sent away in May 1548 to stay with Sir Anthony Denny's household at Cheshunt and never saw her beloved stepmother again, although the two corresponded. Elizabeth immediately wrote a letter to the Queen and Seymour after she left Chelsea. The letter demonstrates a sort of remorse. Cat Ashley, whose deposition was given after Catherine had died and Seymour had been arrested for another attempt at marrying Lady Elizabeth, had developed a crush on Seymour during her time at Chelsea and encouraged her charge to play along. At one point she even made a comment at how lucky Elizabeth would have been to have a husband like Seymour. Ashley even told Lady Elizabeth that Seymour had confided his sentiments to her of wanting to marry Elizabeth before Catherine. After Catherine's death, Ashley strongly encouraged Elizabeth to write to Seymour offering her condolences, to comfort him of his sorrow, for he would think great kindness therein. In June 1548, Catherine, accompanied by Lady Jane Grey, moved to Sudeley Castle, in Gloucestershire. The Dowager Queen promised to provide education for her. It was there that Catherine would spend the last few months of her pregnancy and the last summer of her life. Catherine gave birth to her only child, a daughter, Mary Seymour, named after Catherine's stepdaughter Mary, on August 30, 1548. Catherine died on September 5, 1548, at Sudeley Castle, from what is thought to have been childbed fever. This illness was common due to the lack of hygiene around childbirth. Catherine's funeral was held on September 7, 1548. It was the first Protestant funeral held in English. Her chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey. She was buried in St. Mary's Chapel on the grounds of Sudeley Castle, Gloucestershire, England. Thomas Seymour was beheaded for treason on March 20, 1549, and Mary Seymour was taken to live with the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, a close friend of Catherine's. Catherine's other jewels were kept in a coffer with 5 drawers at Sudeley, and this was sent to the Tower of London on April 20, 1549, and her clothes and papers followed in May. After a year and a half, on March 17, 1550, Mary's property was restored to her by the Restitution of Mary Seymour Act 1549, and her clothes and papers followed in May. After a year and a half, on March 17, 1550, Mary's property was restored to her by the Restitution of Mary Seymour Act 1549, easing the burden of the infant's household on the Duchess. The last mention of Mary Seymour on record is on her 2nd birthday, and although stories circulated that she eventually married and had children, most historians believe she died as a child at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire.